From 2010 to 2018, the number of registered Latino voters in the state increased by 85.8%, according to the Mauricio Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy. With the population expected to continue growing in the next coming years, how can civic engagement be encouraged within communities, and what challenges and perceptions exist? With me in the studio are Zulma Rivera, Neighbor to Neighbor community organizer, and Nayroby Rosa-Soriano, Director of Community Engagement and Resident Services for OneHolyoke CDC, to provide some insight on this topic. Even though an individual is registered to vote, that doesn't mean that once election time rolls around, they're not getting out to the polls. What are the Latino voter turnout rates in our communities?
Well, in the last municipal election, the voter turnout was less than 5%.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's a huge issue because registered Latinos throughout the whole city is almost about right under maybe 45%. So we account for almost half of the vote. And yeah, we're not really getting out there to express our vote or express ourselves to be able to get constituents to represent our neighborhoods the way we really want because we're not getting out there.
And this is in Springfield.
That's correct.
Nayroby and Holyoke, what have you seen the Latino voter turnout rate be?
I believe that it's also very low, and I think it has a lot to do with just being able to understand where it is to go vote and just some lack of knowledge and exposure around that topic.
What other issues do you see in the Latino community about being engaged with voting?
I think a lot of people lost faith in the system itself, right? It's one, the lack of education around the candidates and the process itself. It's a huge problem for some, but also from what they hear in the media and in their own neighborhoods, they're questioning, is it even worth going out to vote? You know, and they prefer to leave it to another person versus making sure that they're excited enough to get out there.
I completely agree with that. I think it has a lot to do with just really not understanding or not receiving the responses that they've wanted. And so because of that, it's better to just shut down and avoid it than to really know that the more you speak out and the more you go out and make a choice, the more effective it will be for everyone.
And what happens when individuals from a community silence themselves and kind of leave it up to other people to fix the problems? What are issues that can come along with that?
Well, you're allowing your voice to get shut down, right? Like the voting process is the only system we have in place to get true representation to represent us. So when you're not voting, you're basically giving the option for someone else to decide who's going to dictate your life or what's going to happen, because what people need to understand is that our whole lives are political, believe it or not, whether they want to be in it or not. From the minute you're born to the day you die, your life is political. Whether you want to be proactive in it or not. And so it is like our civic duty to make sure that we engage ourselves, even if it's just a small little bit, just to have a phone conversation with an elected official or just check out the issues that are happening within your communities so that you can really have a say in what's going to happen with your community. And community is also another problem, right? Where we're not having the sense of community anymore. Everyone's divided. It's not like before where it was just a pack of, a select group of people. Now we're all over the city. And so I think people need to really start identifying with who they really are, say, I am Latino. Mm-hmm. I live in the poorest districts of the city of Springfield. Mm-hmm. I am a homeowner, really start seeing how their taxes can affect them and really start engaging on just starting to know little by little how it is it really affects their daily life.
I agree with that, absolutely. And I think that, a huge component of that is something that you mentioned earlier around education and around really understanding how the system works and really figuring out, how are laws put into place, how are bills passed, who has the right to know what information, and how you can reach out to your legislators and complain or talk about certain things that are affect you, and then be able to really initiate that conversation with our constituents and try to be able to get our voices heard. I think that is a huge factor.
And you mentioned that whereas before there might be one community that's a Latino community, but now it's kind of spread out amongst the cities. Mm-hmm. What are some ways and strategies that you all have tried to engage that community and bring them together?
I try to meet people where they're at. Mm-hmm. There's, I would prefer that we're proactive in avoiding certain situations in our life, but a lot of people tend to move when things happen to them, unfortunately. And so I try to meet people where they're at so that there's a common interest there, and see how systemically it's really impacting them, because a lot of people internalize things and they think that it's them individually, right? But when they start seeing that, this person is experiencing the same thing and a whole group of people have the same common interest, then we can work with that, and that's political, and we can politicize that and try to make a change. And so when I meet them where they're at, I ask them, like, what is it that you want for you? I can't, or anyone or group can decide for someone else what is best for them. Like, the constituents, the communities need to decide for themselves.
Are there any specific strategies that Neighbor to Neighbor has for civic engagement?
Well, we door knock from the spring to elections. And so we have the process of, surveying our selected communities, mostly disproportionate communities, mm-hmm. and we go ask them what are the needs. We also let them have the option of choosing something environmental, right? Something educational, something where it impacts everyone, because every single person has a problem. Every single person has a barrier. And so as Neighbor and Neighbor, we've tried to address things on a systemic level versus an individualized one.
In Nairobi, what has OneHolyoke done to engage the community?
Well, some of the important work that OneHolyoke does has a lot to do with our resident population. Being a community development corporation and having a certain amount of apartments all throughout the city gives us some access to a few residents that really want to engage and kind of figure out and understand the community that they're living in. I know that we oversee, as a resident service director, oversee an elderly building where they're not too familiar with what it is around voting and all the laws and things like that. So I've brought in specialized trainers that really understand how the system works and really sit down in a group and in a group forum and ask questions. What does it take for you to call your legislator and talk about certain things, and how many phone calls does your legislator have to receive in order for them to have to address a matter? And a lot of people don't know that it's just 5 phone calls. And so those are some of the educational workshops that we do in one of our elderly buildings. And then we try to also bring that into our community building that we have in the Flats community to try and offer some supportive services, education services, and do a little bit of as much as we can in community engagement.
And for the people who might think my vote doesn't count, or I really won't make a difference because somebody else will speak up for me, what would you say to them?
If you're working 2 jobs, right, if just to pay the rent, and you are struggling just to even pay your bills or to live, then it's time for you to get active, because it's just not an individual thing. Like I said earlier, it's a thing where it's systemic. And so we can't even afford to live the life that we want to live. Imagine the one that we imagine to live. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a victim to that, then I advise that mm-hmm. you get proactive in figuring out how we're going to be able to change this together.
Right. I think for me, is a lot also around advocacy and education. I think that a lot of residents that aren't as familiar with certain things feel intimidated. They feel that they're not, knowledge enough to understand how the system works and what they need to do. And so it's important to figure out who are my go-to people that I can really sit down with, have a conversation. How can I become more empowered to have those conversations with the people I need to, and really understand things that are going to affect us in the community.
And the truth is, sometimes, like, you and playing devil's advocate here, you have to be sympathetic, because are the consequences of standing up to the powers that be really worth it, right? Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about your life, is it worth it? Is it worth really, getting pushback from systems that really don't benefit you? And people fear that.
Are there reasons why people wouldn't want to register to vote?
I think it has a lot to do with just the lack of understanding, and also I think culturally, it isn't something that especially in the Latino community and the immigrant communities, that you kind of are born into understanding. It's like automatically this is how the system works. We, at 18, you're registered to vote. Culturally, that isn't the important thing, especially in a community that there's a lot of poverty. I mean, families are worried about putting food on the table, and you're 18, you can get a job, and that's the main focus, is survival, and it's not thinking ahead as to how, if my child isn't registered to vote, or if I am not and I'm not, they're not thinking ahead of what the consequences of that would be. So I think it's just because they're in survival mode. They're in what is my next step to making sure I'm getting food on the table versus what's the vote going to do?
Exactly.
And I think that's a mindset that we have to work on changing.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, this year marks the 100th year of women's voting rights. How do you think that made a historical impact, and how do you think that relates to today?
I think women have fought for our rights forever, right? And the truth is that we've been the engine behind the wheel since the beginning of time. And so it's just now where we're like, maybe it's time for us to show our face, and we're doing it in all type of ways and platforms. And it was the year of the woman last year, the year before, and we're going to continue. Like, I honestly believe that women are going to be the change to the face that's going to change the world.
And I mean, I think we see it in history. We see it with the changes that have happened. We went from the first Black president, and now we have, a lot of other women that are running for president. And we had that last year, the last election, we had that. And so to be able to see how far women have come, I mean, it's empowering, and it's really productive to see when women and young women can see that there could be a future, whether it's in politics, whether it's, just being a leader of an organization and really representing the Latino community or the female community.
Thank you both for sharing all that information with us. Thank you. Nobody knows a community better than its residents. Their contributions made through civic engagement can help make a difference, and the more voices heard in a community contribute to its success. Stay tuned for more to come on Presencia, las muchas voces de un pueblo.
¿Quieres conocer más de los latinos en Nueva Inglaterra? Te invito a visitar nuestra página de la web wgbY.org/presencia. Haz un clic para que conozcas sobre nuestra herencia, tradiciones, cultura, diversidad y más. Queremos que tu voz sea escuchada.